Chapter 17. Innovation. Can the future match the great inventions of the past? We wanted flying cars. Instead, we got 140 characters. Peter Thiel. Introduction. The epical rise in the U.S. standard of living that occurred from 1870 to 1940, with continuing benefits to 1970, represents the fruits of the Second Industrial Revolution, IR number 2. Many of the benefits of this unprecedented tidal wave of inventions shows up in measured GDP, and hence in output per person, output per hour, and total factor productivity, TFP, which, as we have seen, grew more rapidly during the half-century 1920 to 70 than before or since. Beyond their contribution to the record of measured growth, these inventions also benefited households in many ways that escaped measurement by GDP along countless dimensions, including the convenience, safety, and brightness of electric light compared to oil lamps, the freedom from the drudgery of carrying water made possible by clean piped water, the value of human life itself made possible by the conquest of infant mortality, and many others. The slower growth rate of measured productivity since 1970 constitutes an important piece of evidence that the Third Industrial Revolution, IR number 3, associated with computers and digitalization has been less important than IR number 2. Not only has the measured record of growth been slower since 1970 than before, but, as we have previously suggested, the unmeasured improvements in the quality of everyday life created by IR number 3 are less significant than the more profound set of unmeasured benefits of the earlier Industrial Revolution. Though there has been continuous innovation since 1970, it has been less broad in its scope than before, focused on entertainment and information and communication technology, ICT, and advances in several dimensions of the standard of living related to food, clothing, appliances, housing, transportation, health, and working conditions have advanced at a slower pace than before 1970. This chapter addresses the unknown future by examining closely the nature of recent innovations and by comparing them with future aspects of technological change that are frequently cited as most likely to boost the American standard of living over the next few decades. Innovation is proceeding apace, and almost weekly, the stock market rewards newly created firms with initial public offering, IPO, valuations of $1 billion or more. There is no debate about the frenetic pace of innovative activity, particularly in the spheres of digital technology, including robots and artificial intelligence. Instead, this chapter distinguishes between the pace of innovation and the impact of innovation on the growth rates of labor productivity and TFP. The chapter begins with a historical overview of the source of inventions since 1870 and emphasizes a U-shaped history in which the role of the individual inventor dominated the late 19th century, followed by most of the 20th century when major inventions occurred within the research laboratories of giant corporations. After 1975, the individual entrepreneur returned as the modern electronic age was created by individuals such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, and Mark Zuckerberg. Equipped with this historical background, we then examine the quantitative record of progress. The post-1970 years have not witnessed a uniformly slow advance of TFP. Instead, the impact on TFP of the inventions of IR number 3 were centered on the decade 1994 to 2004. We describe changes in business practices in the office, in the retail sector, and in the banking and financial sector, and find in all cases that current methods of production had been largely achieved by 2004. Along numerous quantitative measures that compare the 1994 to 2004 decade with the recent past, we find a marked slowing down leading to the suggestion that the wave of innovation in the late 1990s may have been unique, unlikely to be repeated over our forecasting horizon of the next quarter century. The chapter then looks into the future, providing numerous historical examples in which forecasts of the future development of technology turned out to be relatively accurate. We focus on the development of robots and artificial intelligence, and assess the forecasts made by techno-optimists that the U.S. economy is on the verge of a new surge of productivity growth at the cost of massive future job destruction, as robots replace large numbers of jobs and as highly sophisticated computer algorithms eliminate analytical jobs from legal searches to personal financial analysis. The chapter concludes with an alternative version of the future, in which the job destruction by robots and artificial intelligence proceeds slowly, just as it has over the past several decades. The economy will be able to maintain relatively full employment, as the fruits of computerization cause the composition of job types and categories to evolve only slowly, rather than in a great rush. The rate of advance of labor productivity in TFP over the next quarter century will resemble the slow pace of 2004 to 15, not the faster growth rate of 1994 to 2004, much less the even faster growth rate achieved long ago during 1920 to 70. Innovation through history, the ultimate risk takers. The entrepreneurs who created the great inventions of the late 19th century, not just Americans, including Thomas Edison and the Wright brothers, but also foreigners such as Carl Benz, deserve credit for most of the achievements of IR number 2, which created unprecedented advances in the American standard of living in the century after 1870. Individual inventors were the developers not just of new goods, from electric light to the automobile to processed cornflakes to radio, but also of new services, such as the department store, mail-order catalog retailing, and the motel by the side of the highway. Although this book's coverage begins in 1870, we should not neglect the role of individuals before that year. Among the Americans notable for pre-1870 inventions are Samuel F. B. Morse for his 1844 invention of the telegraph, and Cyrus McCormick for his 1834 invention of the reaper. They were preceded by many British inventors going back to Thomas Newcomen and James Watt, the inventors of the steam engine, and George Stephenson, who shares in the invention of the railroad. Most studies of long-term economic growth attempt to subdivide the sources of growth among the inputs, particularly the number of worker hours and the amount of physical capital per worker hour, and the residual that remains after the contributions of labor and capital are subtracted out. That residual, defined initially in Robert Solow's pioneering work of the 1950s, often goes by its nickname, Solow's residual, or by its more former rubric, Total Factor Productivity, TFP. Though primarily reflecting the role of innovation and technological change, increases in TFP also respond to other types of economic change going beyond innovation. For instance, the movement over time of a large percentage of the working population from low productivity jobs on the farm to higher productivity jobs in the city. Solow found, to his own surprise and to others, that only 13% of the increase in U.S. output per worker between 1910 and 1950 resulted from an increase in capital per worker. This famous result seemed to take the capital out of capitalism. The usual association of TFP growth with innovation misses the point that innovation is the ultimate source of all growth in output per worker hour. Not just the residual after capital investment is subtracted out. Capital investment itself waxes and wanes depending not just on the business cycle, but also on the potential profit made possible by investing to produce newly invented or improved products. Without innovation, there would be no accumulation of capital per worker. As Evsey Domar famously wrote in 1961, without technical change, capital accumulation would amount to piling wooden plows on top of existing wooden plows. Technological change raises output directly and induces capital accumulation to create the machines and structures needed to implement new inventions. In addition, innovations are the source of improvements in the quality of capital. For example, the transition from the rotary dial telephone to the iPhone, or from the Marchant calculator to the personal computer running Excel. The standard technique of aggregating capital input by placing a higher weight on short-lived capital such as computers than on long-lived capital like structures has the effect of hiding inside the capital input measure the contribution of innovation in shifting investment from structures to computers. This leaves education and reallocation as the remaining sources of growth beyond innovation itself. However, both of these also depend on innovation to provide the rewards necessary to make the investment to stay in school or to move from farm to city. This is why there was so little economic growth between the Roman era and 1750, as peasant life remained largely unchanged. Peasants did not have an incentive to become educated, because before the wave of innovations that began around 1750, there was no reward to the acquisition of knowledge beyond how to move a plow and harvest a field. Similarly, without innovation before 1750, the reallocation of labor from farm to city did not happen. It required the innovations that began in the late 18th century and that created the great urban industries to provide the incentive of higher wages to induce millions of farm workers to lay down their plows and move to the cities. Thus, every source of growth can be reduced back to the role of innovation and technological change. Pioneers in the development of particular products and industries have been described by Schumpeter as innovators, those individuals who are daring, speculative, restless, imaginative, and, more pertinently, eager to exploit new inventions. Thus, innovators, particularly when acting by themselves or in small partnerships, are the ultimate risk-takers. Their inventions may lead them to create large firms, or their inventions may be supplanted by alternatives that are more efficient and perform better. Or they may have a promising idea and fail to find a source of funding for development of that idea. Invention at the level of the individual is anything but mechanical, automatic, and predictable. Chance plays a tremendous role. Few descriptions of the role of risk and chance in the process of invention are as evocative as that of D.H. Killefer, writing in 1948, "Inventions do not spring up perfect and ready for use. Their conception is never virginal and must be many times repeated. One seldom knows who the real father is. The period of gestation is long, with many false pains and strange forebirths. Few of the children of the mind ever survive, and those only after many operations and much plastic surgery." William Baumol offers a related caution. Entrepreneurs contribute to economic growth far more than the narrow word innovation can convey. The explosion of U.S. entrepreneurial innovation after the Civil War is documented in Figure 17.1, which displays the ratio of patents relative to the total population from 1790 to 2012. The large jump in patents during the 1860 to 1880 period coincides with the dates of the great inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, including electric light and power, 1879, 1882, the telephone, 1876, and the internal combustion engine, 1879. Patents per capita remained at a plateau over the interval between 1870 and 1940. There was then a dip through 1985, followed by an explosion, particularly after 1995. Average ratios in Figure 17.1 over successive intervals are 18 for 1790 to 1830, 89 for 1830 to 1870, 344 from 1870 to 1940, 275 from 1940 to 1985, and then 485 from 1985 to 2012. The last 3 decades of the 19th century were the glory years of the self-employed American entrepreneur-inventor. Horatio Alger-like fantasies were conjured up by the concrete achievements of inventors like Bell and Edison, whose names were widely known and whose latest inventions were publicized and discussed. The goal of becoming an individual entrepreneur, a self-made man, excited dreams of young men. Even a few would be able to follow the steps of social mobility pioneered by Edison. Nevertheless, many of the manufacturing firms of this era were founded by owners who had begun as ordinary workers. To start one's own business, that is, to be an entrepreneur, was a badge of success. To remain a mere employee was to forsake a life of striving for a condition of dependency, itself a sign of moral failing. The U-shaped interpretation of entrepreneurial history starts with a primary role for individual entrepreneurs, working by themselves or in small research labs like Edison's. By the 1920s, the role of the individual entrepreneur reached the bottom part of the U, as innovation came to be dominated by employees working for large corporate research laboratories. Much of the early development of the automobile culminating in the powerful Chevrolets and Buicks of 1940 to 41 was achieved at the GM corporate research labs. Similarly, much of the development of the electronic computer was carried out in the corporate laboratories of IBM, Bell Labs, and other large firms. The transistor, the fundamental building block of modern electronics and digital innovation, was invented by a team led by William Shockley at Bell Labs in late 1947. The corporate R&D division of IBM pioneered most of the advances of the mainframe computer era from 1950 to 1980. Improvements in consumer electric appliances occurred at large firms such as General Electric, General Motors, and Whirlpool, while RCA led the early development of television. But then the process began to climb the right side of the U, as the seminal developments of the transition from mainframes to personal computers and the Internet were pioneered by individual entrepreneurs. A pivotal point in this transition was the decision of IBM, the developer in 1981 of the first widely purchased personal computer, to farm out not just the conception of the operating system software, but also the ownership of that software to 2 young entrepreneurs, Paul Allen and the Harvard dropout Bill Gates, who had founded Microsoft in 1975. The Third Industrial Revolution, which consists of the computer, digitalization, and communication inventions of the past 50 years, has been dominated by small companies founded by individual entrepreneurs, each of whom created organizations that soon became very large corporations. Allen and Gates were followed by Steve Jobs at Apple, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, Sergey Brin and Larry Page at Google, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, and many others. The left side of the entrepreneurial U is well documented. The percentage of all U.S. patents granted to individuals, as contrasted with business firms, fell from 95% in 1880 to 73% in 1920, to 42% in 1940, and then gradually to 21% in 1970, and 15% in 2000. Of the remainder, until 1950, almost all were granted to U.S. firms. But after 1950, the share going to foreign firms soared until in 2000, the 85% not granted to individuals were divided almost evenly, with 44% going to U.S. firms and 41% to foreign firms. Nicholas attributes the decline in the share of independent invention to the growth of complex, capital-intensive areas such as chemicals and electricity. The declining role of individuals occurred not just because of the increased capital requirements of ever more complex products, but also because the individuals who developed the most successful products formed large business enterprises, including Bell, Edison, and Ford, among many others. Edison's early light bulb patents ran out in the mid-1890s, leading to the establishment of General Electric laboratories to develop better filaments. By the same time Bell's initial telephone invention had become the giant AT&T, which established its own laboratory, which eventually became known as Bell Labs. By 1915, it had developed amplifiers that made feasible nationwide long-distance telephone calls. Successive inventions were then credited to the firm, rather than to the individual. Furthermore, a natural process of diminishing returns occurred in each industry. The number of patents issued in 3 industries that were new in the early 20th century, the automobile, airplane, and radio, exhibit an initial explosion of patent activity, followed by a plateau, or in the case of automobiles after 1925, an absolute decline. Richard Nelson describes this pattern as widespread. Following the breakthrough of a basic invention, there is at first a rising, then a falling rate of increase in practical adoptions of the new invention. In time, the new invention is made obsolete by still newer inventions, and its use declines or falls off entirely. Individual inventors flourished in the United States in part because of the democratic nature of the patenting system. From the beginning, the U.S. patent system was self-consciously designed to be different from European systems, and nearly all of the alterations can be viewed as extending effective property rights in technological discoveries to classes of the population that would not have enjoyed them under traditional intellectual property institutions. Detailed specifications of any patented invention were required to be made public immediately, and the patent fee was set at only 5% of the amount charged in Britain. Patents solved the problem of theft of intellectual property in an environment in which inventors needed to learn about the latest inventions that might be complementary or perhaps a key ingredient in their own newest developments. In the United States, trade in patented technologies through licensing was much more extensive than in Europe, and as a result, technologically creative people without the capital to go into business and directly exploit the fruits of their ingenuity were major beneficiaries. The low cost of patents fostered a unique aspect of American invention, that many of the inventors had only an elementary or secondary education. The patent system allowed them to develop their ideas without a large investment in obtaining a patent. Once the patent was granted, even inventors who had a low personal income were able to attract capital funding and also to sell licenses. The U.S. patent system was revolutionary in its extension of effective property rights into an extremely wide spectrum of the population. Moreover, it was exceptional in recognizing that it was in the public interest that patent rights, like other property rights, should be clearly defined and well enforced, with low transaction costs. The democratic nature of the U.S. patent system may help to explain why so many of the great inventions of the late 19th century happened in the United States rather than in Europe. In a famous example discussed in Chapter 6, on February 14, 1876, both Elisha Gray and Alexander Graham Bell arrived at the Patent Office to register their competing telephone technologies. Bell arrived a few hours earlier and became rich and famous, and Gray was forgotten. Years earlier, Antonio Meucci had developed his own version of the telephone, but could not afford the patent application process in Italy. Appearing to contradict the U-shaped evolution of innovation by individuals is the failure of the patent share of individuals to turn around after 1980. Instead, that share remains flat at 15%, down from 95% in 1880. This may be explained by the more rapid formation of corporations by individuals in the past 3 decades than in the late 19th century. Though the Harvard dropout Bill Gates may be said to have invented personal computer operating systems for the IBM personal computer, almost all Gates's patents were obtained after he formed the Microsoft Corporation in 1975, 6 years before IBM granted Microsoft the right to design and sell software for the earliest IBM PC. The same goes for the other individuals who developed Google's search software and Facebook's social network. Even though this wave of innovation is created by the Patent Office to firms rather than individuals, it was made possible by individual inventors and entrepreneurs more directly than the earlier 20th century inventions of Bell Labs and the other large corporate research organizations. The historical record, the growth of total factory productivity. We previously learned in Figures 1.2 and 16.5 that growth in total factor productivity, TFP, was much faster between 1920 and 1970 than either before 1920 or since 1970. Now we take a closer look at the behavior of TFP growth for the years since 1970. Shown by vertical bars in Figure 17.2 are the growth rates of TFP for 1890 to 1920, 1920 to 1970, and 3 sub-periods since 1970. The first of these intervals, 1970 to 94, exhibits TFP growth of only 0.57% per year, less than a third of the 1.89% growth rate achieved in the 50 years before 1970. Then the 2 most recent decades between 1994 and 2014 are shown separately, with TFP growth notably faster in 1994 to 2004 than in the other 2 post-1970 intervals. Black is used to fill in the bars for the 2 periods with relatively rapid TFP growth, 1920 to 70 and 1994 to 2004. Light gray is used to show the contrast with all the other intervals in which TFP growth is below 0.6% per year. The contrast between the black and gray bars in Figure 17.2 supports our interpretation that the great surge in the level of TFP was achieved primarily between 1920 and 1970, and was the result of the implementation and extension of many of the great inventions associated with the Second Industrial Revolution, IR number 2, of the late 19th century. The brief revival of TFP growth in 1994 to 2004 reflects the contribution of the Third Industrial Revolution, IR number 3, associated with computers and digitalization. Judged by their contributions to TFP growth, the 2 industrial revolutions were quite different. IR number 2 created a great surge of TFP growth that lasted for a half-century, while IR number 3 caused a revival in TFP growth during 1994 to 2004 that was much shorter-lived and smaller in magnitude. The overwhelming dominance of the 1920 to 70 interval in making possible the modern world is clearly demonstrated. Though the great inventions of IR number 2 mainly took place between 1870 and 1900, at first their effect was small. Paul David has provided a convincing case that almost 4 decades were required after Edison's first 1882 power station for the development of the machines and methods that finally allowed the electrified factory to emerge in the 1920s. Similarly, Carl Benz's invention of the first reliable internal combustion engine in 1879 was followed by 2 decades in which inventors experimented with brakes, transmissions, and other ancillary equipment needed to transfer the engine's power to axles and wheels. Even though the first automobiles appeared in 1897, they did not gain widespread acceptance until the price reductions made possible by Henry Ford's moving assembly line, introduced in 1913. Why did the growth of TFP accelerate so rapidly after 1920? And why was the influence of IR number 2 so profound? The saga of the roaring 1920s, followed by the dislocations of the Great Depression and World War II, disguises a rapid pace of innovation and implementation that started in the 1920s and took flight, both figuratively and literally, in the 1930s and 1940s, a story told in Chapter 16. The digital revolution, IR number 3, also had its main effect on TFP after a long delay. Even though the mainframe computer transformed many business practices starting in the 1960s, and the personal computer largely replaced the typewriter and calculator by the 1980s, the main effect of IR number 3 on TFP was delayed until the 1994 to 2004 decade, when the invention of the Internet, web browsing, search engines, and e-commerce produced a pervasive change in every aspect of business practice. Growth in output per person, our best measure of the rate of improvement in the standard of living, can proceed no faster than growth in output per hour, unless hours worked per person exhibit an increase. Yet the ongoing retirement of the baby boom generation, as we shall see in Chapter 18, is already causing a decline in hours worked per person that is likely to continue for most of the next 25 years. Thus, future growth in output per person will fall short of growth in output per hour, bringing labor productivity growth and its ultimate source, the pace of innovation as measured by TFP, to center stage in any discussion of the future of growth in American well-being. Accordingly, the chronology of Figure 17.2 raises 3 important questions that will concern us throughout the rest of this chapter. First, why was the main effect of IR number 3 on TFP so short-lived that its duration was limited to the 1994 to 2004 decade? Second, why was TFP growth so slow in the most recent 2004 to 14 decade? Third, what are the implications of slow recent TFP growth for the future evolution of TFP and labor productivity over the next quarter century? Achievements to date of the Third Industrial Revolution. The Third Industrial Revolution, IR number 3, encompasses the digital age of information and communication technology, ICT, beginning with the first mainframe computers in the late 1950s and continuing until today and beyond. As we have seen, its main impact on TFP growth was limited to the 1994 to 2004 decade. It was driven by an unprecedented and never-repeated rate of decline in the price of computer speed and memory, and a never-since-matched surge in the share of GDP devoted to investment in information and communication technology, ICT, investment. The mediocre performance of TFP growth after 2004 underlines the temporary nature of the late 1990s revival. More puzzling is the absence of any apparent stimulus to TFP growth in the quarter century between 1970 and 1994. Mainframe computers created bank statements and phone bills in the 1960s and powered airline reservation systems in the 1970s. Personal computers, ATMs, and barcode scanning were among the innovations that created productivity growth in the 1980s. Reacting to the failure of these innovations to boost productivity growth, Robert Solow quipped, "You can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics." Slow TFP growth in this period indicates that the benefits of the first round of computer applications partially masked an even more severe slowdown in productivity growth than would have occurred otherwise in the rest of the economy. The achievements of IR number 3 can be divided into 2 major categories: communications and information technology. Within communications, progress started with the 1983 breakup of the Bell telephone monopoly into non-overlapping regional monopolies. After a series of mergers, landline service was provided primarily by a new version of AT&T and by Verizon, soon to be joined by major cable television companies such as Comcast and Time Warner that offered landline phone service as part of their cable TV and internet packages. The major advances in the communications sphere was the mobile phone, which made a quick transition from heavyweight brick-like models in the 1980s to the sleek small instruments, capable by the late 1990s of phoning, messaging, emailing, and photography. The final communications revolution occurred in 2007 with the introduction by Apple of the iPhone, soon to be imitated by Google's Android operating system installed on phones manufactured mainly by foreign-owned companies, such as Korea's Samsung. By 2015, there were 183 million smartphone users in the United States, or roughly 60 per 100 members of the population. Though landline phone service was dominated by one or two providers in most metropolitan areas, landline phones were becoming increasingly irrelevant in the presence of smartphones. 6 companies competed vigorously to attract smartphone subscribers. The I and the T of ICT began in the 1960s with the mainframe computer, which eliminated boring and routine clerical labor previously needed to prepare telephone bills, bank statements, and insurance policies. Credit cards would not have been possible without mainframe computers to keep track of the billions of transactions. Gradually, electric memory typewriters and later personal computers eliminated repetitive retyping of everything from legal briefs to academic manuscripts. In the 1980s, 3 additional standalone electronic inventions introduced a new level of convenience into everyday life. The first of these was the ATM, which made personal contact with bank tellers unnecessary. In retailing, 2 devices greatly raised the productivity and speed of the checkout process: the barcode scanner and the authorization devices that read credit cards and within seconds denied or approved a transaction. The late 1990s, when TFP growth finally revived, witnessed the marriage of computers and communication. Suddenly, within the brief half-decade interval between 1993 and 1998, the standalone computer was linked to the outside world through the Internet, and by the end of the 1990s, web browsers, web surfing, and email had become universal. The market for Internet services exploded, and by 2004, most of today's Internet gains had been founded. Throughout every sector, paper and typewriters were replaced by flat screens running powerful software. Professors no longer need to subscribe to or store academic journals. Instead, they can access JSTOR, which has 8,000 subscribing institutions and provides full text access to more than 2,000 journals. Although IR number 3 was revolutionary, its effect was felt in a limited sphere of human activity, in contrast to IR number 2, which changed everything. Categories of personal consumption expenditures that felt little effect from the ICT revolution were the purchase of food for consumption at home and away from home, clothing and footwear, motor vehicles and fuel to make them move, furniture, household supplies, and appliances. In 2014, fully 2/3 of consumption expenditures went for services, including rent, healthcare, education, and personal care. Barber and beauty shops were joined by tanning and nail salons. But the ICT revolution had virtually no effect. A pedicure is a pedicure, regardless of whether the customer is reading a magazine, as would occur a decade ago, or reading a book on a Kindle or surfing the web on a smartphone. This brings us back to Solo's quip that we can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics. The final answer to Solo's computer paradox is that computers are not everywhere. We don't eat computers or wear them or drive to work in them or let them cut our hair. We live in dwelling units that have appliances much like those of the 1950s, and we drive in motor vehicles that perform the same functions as in the 1950s, albeit with more convenience and safety. What are the implications of the uneven progress of TFP, as shown in Figure 17.2? Should the 0.40% growth rate of the most recent 2004 to 14 decade be considered the most relevant basis for future growth? Or should our projection for the future be partly or largely based on the 1.03% average TFP growth achieved by the decade 1994 to 2004? There are several reasons, beyond the temporary nature of the TFP growth recovery in 1994 to 2004, to regard those years as unique and not relevant for the next several decades. Could the third industrial revolution be almost over? What factors caused the TFP growth revival of the late 1990s to be so temporary and to die out so quickly? Most of the economy has already benefited from the internet and web revolution, and in this sphere of economic activity, methods of production have been little changed over the past decade. Across the economy, paper-dependent business procedures had by 2004 been replaced by digitalization, and flat screens were everywhere. The revolutions in everyday life made possible by e-commerce and search engines were already well established. Amazon dates back to 1994, Google to 1998, and Wikipedia, as well as iTunes, to 2001. Facebook, founded in 2004, is now more than a decade old. Will future innovations be sufficiently powerful and widespread to duplicate the relatively brief revival in productivity growth that occurred between 1994 and 2004? Supporting the data showing that TFP growth was less than half as quick during 2004 to 14 as during 1994 to 2004 is the appearance that changes in business practices have been substantially slower within the most recent decade than during the prior decade. A slowing transformation of business practices. The digital revolution centered on 1970 to 2000 utterly changed the way offices function. In 1970, the electronic calculator had just been introduced, but the computer terminal was still in the future. Office work required innumerable clerks to operate the keyboards of electric typewriters that had no ability to download content from the rest of the world, and that, lacking a memory, required repetitive retyping of everything from legal briefs to academic research papers. Starting from this world of 1970, by 2000, every office was equipped with web-linked personal computers that not only could perform any word processing task, but also could perform any type of calculation at blinding speed, as well as download multiple varieties of content. By 2005, flat screens had completed the transition to the modern office, and broadband service had replaced dial-up service at home. But then progress slowed. Throughout the world, the equipment used in office work and the productivity of office employees closely resembles that of a decade ago, and business productivity continues to enjoy the permanent increase in personal comfort on the job that was achieved between 1930 and 1970 by the introduction of air conditioning into every office setting. A part of the great transition that was achieved in the 1980s and 1990s was the catalog revolution. Even before the web became pervasive in the late 1990s, libraries had already converted from wooden boxes of paper card catalogs to electronic catalogs that doubled not only as search tools, but as inventory managers, indicating for every search result whether the book or periodical was on the shelf. The parts departments at automobile dealers made a transition at the same time to electronic catalogs from enormous binders into which multiple replacement pages had to be inserted every day. Hardware stores, bookstores, garden nurseries, and indeed, any retail store selling a large number of varieties of products shifted to electronic catalogs over proprietary computer networks, even before the web allowed direct consumer contact with each merchant's catalog. The important point is that this transition from paper to electronic catalogs happened 15 to 25 years ago, and represented a one-time-only source of a jump in the level of productivity, hence a temporary rather than permanent increase in the growth rate of productivity. In the past decade, business practices, while relatively unchanged in the office, have steadily improved outside of the office, as smartphones and tablets have become standard business equipment. A television service repair person arrives not with a paperwork order and clipboard, but rather with a multi-purpose smartphone. Product specification and communication codes are available on the phone, and the customer completes the transaction by scrawling a signature on the phone screen. Paper has been replaced almost everywhere outside of the office. Airlines are well along in equipping pilots with smart tablets that contain all the information previously provided by large paper manuals. Maintenance crews at Exelon's 6 nuclear power stations in Illinois are the latest to be trading in their 3-ring binders for iPads. The switch to tablets boosts productivity by eliminating not just the expense of the paper, but also of photocopying and filing. Interactivity from email to downloads means that maintenance workers can use tablets to get answers more quickly. A leading puzzle of the current age is why the near ubiquity of smartphones and tablets has been accompanied by such slow economy-wide productivity growth, particularly since 2009. One answer is that smartphones are used in the office for personal activities. Some 90% of office workers, whether using their office personal computers or their smartphones, visit recreational websites during the workday. Almost the same percentage admit that they send personal emails, and more than half report shopping for personal purposes during work time. Tracking software suggests that 70% of employees visit retail sites. Stasis in retailing. Since the development of big box retailers in the 1980s and 1990s, and the conversion of checkout aisles to barcode scanners, little has changed in the retail sector. Payment methods have gradually changed from cash and checks to credit and debit cards. In the early years of credit cards in the 1970s and 1980s, checkout clerks had to make voice phone calls for authorization. Then there was a transition to terminals that would dial the authorization phone number, and now the authorization arrives within a few seconds. The big box retailers brought with them many other aspects of the productivity revolution. Walmart and others transformed supply chains, wholesale distribution, inventory management, pricing, and product selection. But that productivity-enhancing shift away from traditional small-scale retailing is largely over. The retail productivity revolution is high on the list of the many accomplishments of IR number 3 that are largely completed and will be difficult to surpass in the next several decades. What is often forgotten is that we are well into the computer age, and many Home Depots and local supermarkets have self-checkout lines that allow customers to scan their groceries or paint cans through a standalone terminal. But except for small orders, doing so takes longer, and customers still voluntarily wait in line for a human instead of taking the option of the no-wait self-checkout lane. Same theme, that the most obvious uses of electronic devices have already happened, pervades commerce. Airport baggage sorting belts are mechanized, as is most of the process of checking in for a flight. But at least one human agent is still needed at each airline departure gate to deal with seating issues and standby passengers. While the main impact on retail productivity growth of big box stores and warehouse clubs had largely occurred by a decade ago, the past decade has witnessed the continued rapid growth of e-commerce that inherently operates at a higher level of labor productivity than brick-and-mortar retail stores. While nominal annual e-commerce sales grew 11-fold from 2000 to 2014, the share of e-commerce in all retail sales in 2014 was still only 6.4%, a fraction too small for e-commerce to have a major impact on productivity growth in the overall retail sector. much less in the economy as a whole. See Hortach-Su and Syverson, 2015, page 7. A plateau of activity in finance and banking. The ICT revolution changed finance and banking along many dimensions, from the humble street corner ATM to the development of fast trading on the stock exchanges. Both the ATM and billion-share trading days are creations of the 1980s and 1990s. Average daily shares transacted on the New York Stock Exchange increased from only 3.5 million in 1960 to 1.7 billion in 2005, and then declined to around 1.2 billion per day in early 2015. Figure 17.3 shows the average annual growth rate of shares transacted over 5-year intervals, with the first bar referring to 1960 to 65, and the final, negative bar, displaying the growth rate for 2010 to 15. Nothing much has changed in more than a decade, except for the ups and downs of stock prices, and despite all those ATMs, and a transition by many customers to managing their bank accounts online rather than by visiting bank branches, the nation still maintains a system of 97,000 bank branches, many of which are empty much of the time, and employment of bank tellers has declined only from 484,000 in 1985 to 361,000 recently. James Besson explains the longevity of bank branches in part by the effect of ATMs in reducing the number of employees needed per branch from about 20 in 1988 to a little more than 13 in 2004. That meant it was less expensive for a bank to open a branch, leading banks to increase the number of bank branches by 43% over the same period between 1988 and 2004. This provides an example that the effect of robots, in this case ATMs, in causing a destruction of jobs is often greatly exaggerated. Besson shows also that the invention of bookkeeping software did not prevent the number of accounting clerks from growing substantially between 1999 and 2009, although other evidence suggests that corporate financial software is continuing to reduce employment in corporate finance departments. The home and consumer electronics. Each of the sectors discussed earlier, office work, retailing, finance, banking, went through fundamental and transformative changes in the 1980s and 1990s. Only within the past decade have computer hardware, software, and business methods ossified into a slowly changing set of routines. In contrast to the decade or so of stability in procedures at work, life inside the home has been stable, not for a single decade, but for nearly a half-century. By the 1950s, all the major household appliances, washer, dryer, refrigerator, range, dishwasher, and garbage disposal, had been invented, and by the early 1970s, they had reached most American households. Besides the microwave oven, the most important change has been the comfort provided by air conditioning. By 2010, almost 70% of American dwelling units were equipped with central air conditioning. Aside from air conditioning, the major changes in the home in the half-century since 1965 were all in the categories of entertainment, communication, and information devices. Television made its transition to color between 1965 and 1972. Then variety increased with cable television in the 1970s and 1980s. And finally, picture quality was improved with high-definition signals and receiving sets. Variety increased even further when Blockbuster and then Netflix made it possible to rent an almost infinite variety of motion picture DVDs. And now movie streaming has become common. For the past decade, homes have had access to entertainment and information through fast broadband connections to the web, and smartphones have made the web portable. But now that smartphones and tablets have saturated their potential market, further advances in consumer electronics have become harder to achieve. The sense that technical change is slowing down in consumer electronic goods was palpable at the 2014 Consumer Electronics Show, CES. But in some ways, this show was a far cry from the shows of old. Over the years, it has been the place to spot some real innovations. In 1970, the video cassette recorder was introduced at CES. In 1981, the compact disc player had its debut there. High-definition TV was unveiled in 1998. The Microsoft Xbox in 2001. This year's crop of products seems a bit overwhelming by comparison. The editor of a gadget website said, "This industry that employs all of these engineers and has all of these factories and salespeople needs you to throw out your old stuff and buy new stuff, even if that new stuff is only slightly upgraded." Decline in business dynamism. Recent research has used the word dynamism to describe the process of creative destruction by which new startups and young firms are the source of productivity gains that occur when they introduce best practice technologies and methods as they shift resources away from old low productivity firms. As shown in Figure 17.4, the share of all business firms, consisting of young firms, aged 5 years or younger, declined from 14.6% in 1978 to only 8.3% in 2011, even as the share of firms exiting, going out of business, remained roughly constant in the range of 8 to 10%. It is notable that the share of young entering firms had already declined substantially before the 2008-09 financial crisis. Measured another way, the share of total employment accounted for by firms no older than 5 years declined by almost half, from 19.2% in 1982 to 10.7% in 2011. This decline was pervasive across retailing and services, and after 2000, the high-tech sector experienced a large decline in startups and fast-growing young firms. In another measure of the decline in dynamism, the percentage of people younger than 30 who owned stakes in private companies declined from 10.6% in 1989 to 3.6% in 2014. Related research on labor market dynamics points to a decline in fluidity as job reallocation rates fell more than a quarter after 1990, and worker reallocation rates fell more than a quarter after 2000. Slower job and worker reallocation means that new job opportunities are less plentiful, and it is harder to gain employment after long jobless spells. For the employed, it hampers their ability to switch employers so as to move up a job ladder, change careers, and satisfy locational constraints. Job mobility facilitates wage growth and career advancement. This line of active current research has uncovered multiple dimensions of the declining dynamism of American society, as indicated by the declining pace of startups, job creation, job destruction, and internal migration. Objective measures of slowing economic growth. Thus far, this section has provided two measures of a slowing pace of economic progress: the end of growth in stock market shares transacted and a sharp decline in business dynamism, measured by the rate of entry of newly created business firms. These indicators coincide with the sharp decline in the growth of TFP that occurs when the most recent decade, 2004 to 14, is compared with the prior decade, 1994 to 2004. We now turn to additional objective measures that uniformly depict an economy that experienced a spurt of productivity and innovation in the 1994 to 2004 decade, but that has slowed since then, in some cases, to a crawl. Manufacturing capacity. The Federal Reserve reports monthly its Index of Industrial Production and Industrial Capacity, as well as the ratio of the two, the rate of capacity utilization. Shown in Figure 17.5 is the annual growth rate of manufacturing capacity since 1980. The uniqueness of the 1994 to 2004 decade is evident, as the 5-year growth rate of manufacturing capacity proceeded at an annual rate between 2% and 3%, from 1972 to 1994, surged to almost 7% in the late 1990s, and then came back down, reaching a negative growth rate in 2012. The role of ICT investment in temporarily driving up the growth rate of manufacturing capacity in the late 1990s is well known. Martin Bailey and Barry Bosworth have emphasized that if ICT production is stripped out of the manufacturing data, TFP growth in manufacturing has been an unimpressive 0.3% per year between 1987 and 2011. Daron Acemoglu and co-authors have also found that the impact of ICT on productivity disappears once the ICT-producing industries are excluded. Their finding is that for the remaining industries, there is no tendency for labor productivity to grow faster in industries that are ICT-intensive. That is, that have a relatively high ratio of expenditures on computer equipment to their expenditures on total capital equipment. Net investment. The second reason that the productivity revival of the late 1990s is unlikely to be repeated anytime soon is the behavior of net investment. As shown in Figure 17.6, the ratio of net investment to the capital stock, shown as a 5-year moving average, has been trending down since the 1960s relative to its 1950 to 2007 average value of 3.2%. In fact, during the entire period, 1986 to 2013, the ratio exceeded that 3.2% average value for only 4 years, 1999 to 2002. That was within the interval of the productivity growth revival. The 1.0% value of the moving average in 2013 was less than half of the previous value in 1994 and less than a third of the 3.2% 1950 to 2007 average. Thus, the investment needed to support a repeat of the late 1990s productivity revival has been missing during the past decade. Computer performance. Another piece of evidence that the late 1990s were unique refers to the rate of improvement in computer performance. The 1996 to 2000 interval witnessed the most rapid rate of decline in performance-adjusted prices of ICT equipment recorded to date. The quicker the rate of decline in the ICT equipment deflator, the more quickly the price of computers is declining relative to their performance, or the more quickly computer performance is increasing relative to its price. As shown in the top frame of Figure 17.7, the rate of declining of the ICT equipment deflator peaked at negative 14% in 1999, but then steadily diminished to barely minus 1% in 2010 to 14. The slowing rate of improvement of ICT equipment has been reflected in a sharp slowdown in the contribution of ICT as a factor of production to growth in labor productivity. The latest estimates of the ICT contribution by Gilbert Set and co-authors declines from 0.52 percentage points per year during 1995 to 2004 to 0.19 points per year during 2004 to 2013. Moore's Law. We learned in Chapter 13 that the late 1990s were not only a period of rapid decline in the prices of computer power, but also simultaneously a period of rapid change in the progress of computer chip technology. Moore's Law was originally formulated in 1965 as a forecast that the number of transistors on a computer chip would double every 2 years. The horizontal dashed line in the bottom frame of Figure 17.7 at a vertical distance of 2 years represents the prediction of Moore's Law. The black line plots the actual doubling time, which followed the predicted value of almost exactly 2 years with uncanny accuracy between 1975 and 1990. Then the doubling time crept up to 3 years during 1992 to 96, followed by a plunge to less than 18 months between 1999 and 2003. Indeed, the acceleration of technical progress in chip technology in the bottom frame of Figure 17.7 was the underlying cause of the rapid decline in the ratio of price to performance for computer equipment, shown in the top frame. The doubling time reached a trough of 14 months in 2000, roughly the same time as the peak rate of decline in the computer deflator. But since 2006, Moore's Law has gone off the rails. The doubling time soared to 8 years in 2009 and then declined gradually to 4 years in 2014. Kenneth Flom examines the transition over the past decade toward a substantially slower rate of improvement in computer chips and in the quality-corrected performance of computers themselves. His data shows that the clock speed, a measure of computer performance, has been on a plateau of no change at all since 2003, despite a continuing increase in the number of transistors squeezed onto computer chips. He concludes, "The weight of empirical evidence developed and reviewed in this paper suggests that since 2003 there have been notable reductions in both the rate of price decline and in the pace of technical innovation in the semiconductor manufacturing industry generally, and the microprocessor manufacturing industry in particular. There will be a significant and widely felt economic downside to a reduction in the rate of innovation and semiconductor manufacturing. A slackening of declines in IT hardware prices will, through the same causal links, reduce productivity growth across the broad economy relative to what it would have been had the faster pace of innovation continued." These 4 factors, unique to the late 1990s, the surge in manufacturing capacity, the rise in the net investment ratio, the trough in the rate of decline in computer prices with the associated decline in the contribution of ICT capital to labor productivity growth, and the shift in the timing of Moore's Law, all create a strong case that the dot-com era of the late 1990s was unique in its conjunction of factors that boosted growth in labor productivity and of TFP well above both the rate achieved during 1970 to 94 and during 2004 to 14. There are no signs in recent data that anything like the dot-com era is about to recur. Manufacturing capacity growth turned negative during 2011 to 12. And the net investment ratio fell during 2009 to 13 to barely a third of its post-war average. Can future innovation be predicted? What is in store for the next 25 years? Will technological change accelerate and push TFP well above its rate of the past 40 years? Or does the slow TFP growth achieved in the most recent 2004 to 14 decade indicate that the dot-com revolution of the prior 1994 to 2004 decade was sui generis, an accomplishment unlikely to be repeated? Before speculating about the future, we need to ask whether any such attempt at forecasting is feasible. The usual stance of economic historians, including my colleague, Joel Mokyr, is that the human brain is incapable of forecasting future innovations. He states without qualification that history is always a bad guide to the future, and economic historians should avoid making predictions. He assumes that an instrument is necessary for an outcome. As an example, it would have been impossible for Pasteur to discover his germ theory of disease if Joseph A. Lister had not invented the achromatic lens microscope in the 1820s. Mokyr's optimism about future technological progress rests partly on the dazzling array of new tools that have arrived recently to create further research advances: DNA sequencing machines and cell analysis, high-powered computers, and astronomy, nanochemistry, and genetic engineering, One of Mokir's central tools in facilitating scientific advance is blindingly fast search tools, so that all of human knowledge is instantly available. Mokir's examples of future progress do not center on digitalization, but rather involve fighting infectious diseases, the need of technology to help reduce the environmental pollution caused by excess fertilizer use, and the evocative query, can new technology stop global warming? It is notable that innovations to fight pollution and global warming involve fighting bads rather than creating goods. Instead of raising the standard of living in the same manner as the past 2 centuries of innovations that have brought a wonder of new goods and services for consumers, innovations to stem the consequences of pollution and global warming seek to prevent the standard of living from declining. Mokir and other historians scoff at any attempt to forecast the future. Any pessimist gazing into the future is condemned for a lack of imagination and doomed to repeat the mistakes of past pessimists. But the common assumption that future innovation is non-forecastable is wrong. There are historical precedents of correct predictions made as long as 50 or 100 years in advance. After we review some of these, we will return to today's forecasts for the next quarter century. An early forecast of the future of technology is contained in Jules Verne's 1863 manuscript, Paris in the 20th Century, in which Verne made bold predictions about the Paris a century later in 1960. In that early year, before Edison or Benz, Verne had already conceived of the basics of the 20th century. He predicted rapid transit cars running on overhead viaducts, motor cars with gas combustion engines, and streetlights connected by underground wires. In fact, much of IR number 2 was not a surprise. Looking ahead in the year 1875, inventors were feverishly working on turning the telegraph into the telephone, trying to find a way to transform electricity coming from batteries into electric lights, trying to find a way of harnessing the power of petroleum to create a lightweight and powerful internal combustion engine. The atmosphere of 1875 was suffused with "we're almost there" speculation. After the relatively lightweight internal combustion engine was achieved, flight, humankind's dream since Icarus, became a matter of time and experimentation. Some of the most important sources of human progress over the 1870 to 1940 period were not new inventions at all. Running water had been achieved by the Romans, but it took political will and financial investment to bring it to every urban dwelling place. A separate system of sewer pipes was not an invention, but implementing it over the interval 1870 to 1930 required resources, dedication, and a commitment to using public funds for infrastructure investment. A set of remarkable forecasts appeared in December 1900 in an unlikely publication medium, the Ladies' Home Journal. Some of the predictions were laughably wrong and unimportant, such as strawberries the size of baseballs. But there were enough accurate predictions in this page-long, 3-column article to suggest that much of the future can be known. Some of the more interesting forecasts follow. Hot and cold air will be turned on from spigots to regulate the temperature of the air, just as we now turn on hot and cold water from spigots to regulate the temperature of the bath. Ready-cooked meals will be purchased from establishments, much like our bakeries of today. Liquid air refrigerators will keep large quantities of food fresh for long intervals. Photographs will be telegraphed from any distance. If there is a battle in China a century hence, photographs of the events will be published in newspapers an hour later. Automobiles will be cheaper than horses are today. Farmers will own automobile hay wagons, automobile truck wagons. Automobiles will have been substituted for every horse vehicle now known. Persons and things of all types will be brought within focus of cameras connected with screens at opposite ends of circuits. thousands of miles at a span. The lips of a remote actor or singer will be heard to offer words or music when seen to move. The Jules Verne 1863 and the Ladies' Home Journal 1900 visions of future technological progress were true leaps of imagination. Somewhat less challenging were predictions of the future made at the 1939-40 New York World's Fair. By then, IR number 2 was almost complete in urban America, so it is no surprise that the exhibits at the fair could predict quite accurately the further complements to IR number 2 inventions, such as superhighways. A future of air-conditioned homes and businesses was no intellectual stretch at the fair, for air conditioning in movie theaters began in 1922 and was nearly ubiquitous in theaters and new office buildings by the late 1930s. Television was introduced at the fair, and it was easy to predict that the television over the next 2 decades would follow the American model of commercially supported radio, with entertainment provided over several large networks spanning the continent. Although commercial aviation was primitive in 1939, still it was easy to forecast from the rapid progress in the size and speed of aircraft over the 1920-40 period that much larger aircraft could fly much longer distances, and indeed within only a few years the DC-6 and DC-7 were spanning the continent and the globe before the epical introduction of the Boeing 707 jet in 1958. What was missing at the 1939-40 World's Fair was any vision of the computer revolution that created IR number 3. But Norbert Wiener, a visionary, in a 1949 essay that was ultimately rejected by the New York Times, got a lot of the future of IR number 3 right. Among his 1949 predictions were these: "These new machines have a great capacity for upsetting the present bases of industry, and of reducing the economic value of the routine factory employee to a point at which he is not worth hiring at any price. If we move in the direction of making machines which learn and whose behavior is modified by experience, we must face the fact that every degree of independence we give the machine is a degree of possible defiance of our wishes. The genie in the bottle will not willingly go back in the bottle, nor have we any reason to expect them to be well disposed to us." Just as some inventions have come as a surprise, including the entire electronics and digital revolutions, other anticipated inventions never came to pass. Dick Tracy's wrist radio in cartoon comic strips of the late 1940s finally is coming to fruition 70 years later with the Apple Watch. The Jetsons' vertical commuting car plane never happened, and in fact, high fuel costs caused many local helicopter short-haul aviation companies to shut down. As Peter Thiel quipped, "We wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters." The inventions that are now forecastable. Despite the slow growth of TFP recorded by the data of the decade since 2004, commentators view the future of technology with great excitement. Nouriel Rubini writes, "There is a new perception of the role of technology. Innovators and tech CEOs both seem positively giddy with optimism." The well-known pair of techno-optimists, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee, assert that we're at an inflection point between a past of slow technological change and a future of rapid change. They appear to believe that Big Blue's chess victory and Watson's victory on the TV game show Jeopardy presage an age in which computers outsmart humans in every aspect of human work effort. They remind us that Moore's law predicts endless exponential growth of the performance capability of computer chips. But they ignore that chips have fallen behind the predicted pace of Moore's law after 2005. The decline in the price of ICT equipment relative to performance was most rapid in the late 1990s, and there has been hardly any decline at all in the past few years. Exponential increases in computer performance will continue, but at a slower rate than in the past, not at a faster rate. See Figure 17.7. The theme of this chapter is that the main benefits for productivity growth provided by the digital third industrial revolution were centered on the decade between 1994 and 2004. Since 2004, the pace of innovation has been slower, but certainly it has not been zero. The new portability of the web, made possible by smartphones and tablets, has continued to change business practices and consumer well-being. When we examine the likely innovations of the next several decades, we are not doubting that many innovations will continue to occur, but rather are assessing them in the context of the past 2 decades of fast, 1994 to 2004, and then slow, 2004 to 14, growth in TFP. Will the next wave of innovations change business practices in a revolutionary way, as did the dot-com revolution of the late 1990s? Or will innovation cause productivity to increase at an evolutionary pace, like that of the most recent decade? The future advances that are widely forecast by Brynjolfsson, McAfee, and others can be divided into 4 main categories: medical, small robots and 3D printing, big data, and driverless vehicles. Enthusiasts of big data sometimes label this category of advance as artificial intelligence. It is worth examining the potential of each of these categories of future innovation in turn to create a boost in TFP growth back to the level achieved in the late 1990s. Medical and pharmaceutical advances. The most important sources of longer life expectancy in the 20th century were achieved in the first half of that century, when life expectancy rose at twice the rate it did in the last half. This was the interval when infant mortality was conquered, and life expectancy was extended by the discovery of the germ theory of disease, the development of an antitoxin for diphtheria, and the near elimination of contamination of milk and meat, as well as the conquest of air and water distributed diseases through the construction of urban sanitation infrastructure. Many of the current basic tools of modern medicine were developed between 1940 and 1980, including antibiotics, the polio vaccine, procedures to treat coronary heart disease, and the basic tools of chemotherapy and radiation to treat cancer, all advances that contribute to productivity growth. Medical technology has not ceased to advance since 1980, but rather has continued at a slow and measured pace, and life expectancy has continued to improve at a steady rate, as shown in Figure 7.2, while the mortality rate for cardiac-related diseases has steadily declined. It is likely that life expectancy will continue to improve at a rate not unlike that of the past few decades. There are new issues, however. As described by Jan Feig, an eminent geneticist, progress on physical disease and ailments is advancing faster than on mental disease, which has led to widespread concern that in the future there will be a steady rise in the burden of taking care of elderly Americans who are alive, but in a state of dementia. Pharmaceutical research has reached a brick wall of rapidly increasing costs and declining benefits, with a decline in major drugs approved each pair of years over the past decade, as documented by Feig. At enormous cost, drugs are being developed that will treat esoteric types of cancer at costs that no medical insurance system can afford. Feig is highly critical of the current regime of drug testing in the United States as inhibiting risk-taking, an example of the overregulation of the U.S. economy. The upshot is that over the next few decades, medical and pharmaceutical advances will doubtless continue, while the increasing burden of Alzheimer's care will be a significant contributor to increased cost of the medical care system. Small robots and 3D printing. Industrial robots were introduced by General Motors in 1961. By the mid-1990s, robots were welding automobile parts and replacing workers in the lung-killing environment of the automotive paint shop. Until recently, however, robots were large and expensive and needed to be caged off to keep them from smashing into humans. The ongoing reduction in the cost of computer components has made feasible ever smaller and increasingly capable robots. Gil Pratt enumerates 8 technical drivers that are advancing at steady exponential rates. Among those relevant to the development of more capable robots are exponential growth in computer performance, improvements in electromechanical design work, and improvements in electrical energy storage. Others on his list involve more general capabilities of all digital devices, including exponential expansion of local wireless communications, in the scale and performance of the Internet, and in data storage. As an example of the effects of these increasing technical capabilities, inexpensive robots suitable for use by small businesses have been developed and brought to public attention by a 2012 segment on the TV program 60 Minutes, featuring Baxter, a $25,000 robot. The appeal of Baxter is that the cost is so cheap and that it can be reprogrammed to do a different task every day. Other small robots are mobile and can move around the factory floor. Often the robots work with humans rather than replacing them. These small robots are no different in principle from the introduction of machinery dating back to the textile looms and spindles of the early British Industrial Revolution. Most workplace technologies are introduced with the intention of substituting machines for workers. Because this has been going on for 2 centuries, why are there then still so many jobs? Why in mid-2015 was the U.S. unemployment rate close to 5%? Instead of 20 or 50%. David Autor has posed this question as well as answered it. Machines, including futuristic robots, not only substitute for labor, but also complement labor. Most work processes draw upon a multifaceted set of inputs: labor and capital, brains and brawn, creativity and rote repetition, technical mastery and intuitive judgment, perspiration and inspiration, adherence to rules and judicious application of discretion. Typically, these inputs each play essential roles. That is, improvements in one do not obviate the need for the other. Just as Baxter cooperates with human workers, other robots do not just displace workers but also make the remaining workers more valuable and create new jobs, including those who are building and programming the robots. The complementarity between robots and human workers is illustrated by the cooperative work ritual taking place daily in Amazon warehouses, often cited as a frontier example of robotic technology. Far from replacing all human workers, in these warehouses, the Kiva robots do not actually touch any of the merchandise, but rather are limited to lifting shelves containing the objects and moving the shelves to the packer, who lifts the object off the shelf and performs the packing operation by hand. The tactile skills needed for the robots to distinguish the different shapes, sizes, and textures of the objects on the shelves are beyond the capability of current robot technology. Other examples of complementarities include ATMs, which, as already noted, have been accompanied by an increase rather than a decrease in the number of bank branches, and the barcode retail scanner, which works along with the checkout clerk without replacing these employees, with little traction thus far for self-checkout lanes. The exponential increase in computer speed and memory has apparently raced far ahead of the capability of robots to duplicate human movements. Though Google is experimenting with robots shaped like wild animals that can run at great speeds, so far robots are having great difficulty simply standing up. The recent finals of a 3-year competition in which research teams developed the latest robots saw robots fall every which way. They fell on their faces, they fell on their backs, They toppled like toddlers. They folded like cheap suits. They went down like tons of bricks. Daniela Rus, director of MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, provides a summary of some of the limitations of the robots developed to date. Robotic reasoning is limited, and the scope of the robot's reasoning is entirely contained in the program. Tasks that humans take for granted, for example answering the question, "Have I been here before?" are extremely difficult for robots. Further, if a robot encounters a situation that it has not been specifically programmed to handle, it enters an error state and stops operating. Surely multiple function robots will be developed, but it will be a long and gradual process before robots outside of the manufacturing and wholesaling sectors become a significant factor in replacing human jobs in the service, transportation, or construction sectors. And it is in those sectors that the slowness of productivity growth is a problem. For instance, consider the task of folding laundry, which is simple and routine for humans, no matter their level of education. No machine can yet match a human's dexterity and problem-solving abilities when attacking a pile of irregular-shaped clothes of different fabric types and weight. The difference between picking up a lace nightgown versus unraveling a pair of crumpled jeans knotted with other clothes is a calculation that requires massive computing power and a soft touch. 3D printing is another revolution described by the techno-optimists. Its most important advantage is the potential to speed up the design process of new products. New prototypes can be designed in days or even hours, rather than months, and can be created at relatively low cost, lowering one major barrier to entry for entrepreneurs trying to attract financing for their startups. New design models can be simultaneously produced at multiple locations around the world. 3D printing also excels at one-off customized operations, such as the ability to create a crown in a dentist office instead of having to send out a mold, reducing the process of creating and installing a dental crown from 2 office visits to 1. Thus, it may contribute to productivity growth by reducing certain inefficiencies and lowering barriers to entrepreneurship. But these are unlikely to be huge effects felt throughout the economy. 3D printing is not expected to have much effect on mass production, and thus on how most U.S. consumer goods are produced. Big data and artificial intelligence. The core of the optimist's case lies not with physical robots or 3D printing, but with the growing sophistication and human-like abilities of computers that are often described as artificial intelligence. Brynjolfsson and McAfee provide many examples to demonstrate that computers are becoming sufficiently intelligent to supplant a growing share of human jobs. They wonder if automation technology is near a tipping point, when machines finally master traits that have kept human workers irreplaceable. Thus far, it appears that the vast majority of big data is being analyzed within large corporations for marketing purposes. The Economist reported recently that corporate IT expenditures for marketing purposes were increased at 3 times the rate of other corporate IT expenditures. The marketing wizards use big data to figure out what their customers buy and why they move from merchant to merchant. With enough big data, Corporation A may be able to devise a strategy to steal market share from Corporation B, but B will surely fight back with an onslaught of more big data. An excellent current example involves the large legacy airlines with their data-rich frequent flyer programs. The analysts at these airlines are constantly trolling through their big data, trying to understand why they have lost market share in a particular city or with a particular demographic group of travelers. Every airline has a revenue management department that decides how many seats on a given flight on a given day should be sold at cheap, intermediate, and expensive prices. Vast amounts of data are analyzed, and computers examine historical records, monitor day-by-day booking patterns, factor in holidays and weekends, and come out with an allocation. But at a medium-sized airline, JetBlue, 25 employees are required to monitor computers, and the humans must constantly override the computer's decisions. The director of revenue management at JetBlue describes his biggest surprise since taking over his job as how often the staff has to override the computers. Another example of the use of artificial intelligence is in apparel retailing. At Macy's, for instance, algorithmic technology is helping fuse the online and the in-store experience, enabling a shopper to compare clothes online, try something on at the store, order it online, and return it in person. Algorithms let companies target offers to specific consumers while they are shopping in stores. Marketing is just one form of artificial intelligence that has been made possible by big data. Computers are working in fields such as medical diagnosis, crime prevention, and loan approvals. In some cases, human analysts are replaced, but often the computers speed up a process and make it more accurate, working alongside human workers. New software allows consumer lending officers to know borrowers as never before and more accurately predict whether they will repay. Vanguard and Charles Schwab have begun to compete with high-priced human financial advisors by offering robo-advisors, online services that offer automated investment management via software. They use computer algorithms to choose assets consistent with the client's desired allocation at a cost that is a mere fraction of the fees of traditional human advisors. Thus far, robo-advisors mainly appeal to young people who have not yet built up much wealth. This application of artificial intelligence has not yet made much of a dent in advising high-net-worth individuals. It has been estimated recently that the combined assets under management by robo-advisors still amounts to less than $20 billion against $17 trillion for traditional human advisors. Another use of artificial intelligence is now almost 2 decades old. The ability to use modern search tools to find, with blinding speed, valuable nuggets of existing information. The demand for legal associates has declined in part because of the ability of computerized search tools to carry out the process of discovery and search for precedents. Computers are reading millions of documents and sorting them for relevance without getting tired or distracted. As such, analytical power expands in scope. Computers will move nearer to the heart of what lawyers do by advising better than lawyers can on whether to sue or settle or go to trial. These examples of advanced search technology and artificial intelligence indeed are happening now, but they are nothing new. The quantity of electronic data has been rising exponentially for decades without pushing TFP growth out of its post-1970 lethargy, except for the temporary productivity revival period of 1994 to 2004. The sharp slowdown in productivity growth in recent years has overlapped with the introduction of smartphones and iPads, which consume huge amounts of data. These sources of innovation have disappointed in what counts in the statistics on productivity growth, their ability to boost output per hour in the American economy. As shown in Figure 17.2, there has been no response at all of TFP growth to the 2007 introduction of the smartphone or the 2010 introduction of the smart tablet. Driverless cars. This category of future progress is demoted to last place because it offers benefits that are minor compared to the invention of the car itself, or the improvements in safety that have created a tenfold improvement in fatalities per vehicle mile since 1950. The most important distinction is between cars and trucks. People are in cars to go from A to B, much of it for essential aspects of life such as commuting or shopping. Thus, the people must be inside the driverless car to achieve their objective of getting from point A to point B. The additions to consumer surplus of being able to commute without driving are relatively minor. Instead of listening to the current panoply of options, including Bluetooth phone calls, radio news, or internet-provided music. Drivers will be able to look at a computer screen or their smartphones, read a book, or keep up with their email. The use of driverless cars is predicted to reduce the incidence of automobile accidents, continuing the steady decline in automobile accidents and fatalities that has already occurred. Driverless car technology may also help to foster a shift from nearly universal car ownership to widespread car sharing in cities and perhaps suburbs, leading to reductions in gasoline consumption, air pollution, and the amount of land devoted to parking, all of which should have positive effects on quality of life, if not on productivity growth. That leaves the potential future productivity advantage offered by driverless trucks. This is a potentially productivity-enhancing innovation, albeit with the small slice of U.S. employment consisting of truck drivers. However, driving from place to place is only half of what many truck drivers do. Those driving Coca-Cola and bread delivery trucks do not just stop at the back loading dock and wait for a store employee to unload the truck. Instead, the drivers are responsible for loading the cases of Coca-Cola or the stacks of bread loaves onto dollies and placing them manually on the store shelves. In fact, it is remarkable in this late phase of the computer revolution that almost all placement of individual product, cans, bottles, and tubes on retail shelves is achieved today by humans rather than robots. Driverless delivery trucks will not save labor unless work is reorganized so that unloading and placement of goods from the driverless trucks is taken over by workers at the destination location. The enthusiasm of techno-optimists for driverless cars leaves numerous issues unanswered. As pointed out by Otter, the experimental Google car does not drive on roads, but rather proceeds by comparing data from its sensors with painstakingly hand-curated maps. Any deviation of the actual environment from the pre-processed maps, such as a road detour or a crossing guard in place of the expected traffic signal, causes the driving software to blank out and requires instant resumption of control by the human driver. At present, tests of driverless cars are being carried out on multi-lane highways, but test models so far are unable to judge when it is safe to pass on a two-lane road or to navigate winding rural roads in the dark. In the words of computer expert Roos, so far that level of autonomous driving performance has been possible only in low-speed, low-complexity environments. Robotic vehicles cannot yet handle all the complexities of driving in the wild, such as inclement weather and complex traffic situations. These issues are the focus of ongoing research. A future of driverless cars and trucks raises issues of legal liability that are now just beginning to be considered. Nonetheless, both Google and Tesla have announced plans to introduce certain aspects of driverless car technology in the near future. First, as a type of highway autopilot, not too far removed from the old technology of cruise control. Perfection in electronic devices is still years away, as has been demonstrated by defects in voice-activated computer controls. Voice-activated command systems and their software often are badly outdated or unreliable, leading to a tide of customer complaints and research questioning how safe they really are. Voice control can be extremely buggy, and the struggle to get them to work can cause a driver to miss traffic hazards. Consumer Reports magazine found that problems with infotainment systems, music players, navigation, and hands-free systems linking smartphones are now the #1 reason for complaints. Conclusion. The title of this chapter asks, can the future match the great inventions of the past? The criterion for match refers to the standard economic measure of the impact of innovation and technological change. That is, the growth rate of total factor productivity, TFP. Innovation is judged to have a high impact when TFP growth is relatively fast, and to have a low impact when TFP growth is relatively slow. This standard of comparison across eras creates a distinction between the pace of innovation and the impact of innovation on TFP. We contrast the hyperactive pace of innovation at the current time with multi-billion-dollar initial public offerings of tech-related new companies almost every week, with its apparent weak impact, judging by the slow pace of TFP growth exhibited in the data for the past decade. This book has interpreted the ups and downs of TFP growth since the late 19th century as the result of successive industrial revolutions. The most remarkable fact about TFP performance is that rapid growth was not spread out evenly over the 12-plus decades since 1890, but rather was concentrated in the middle of the 20th century, with an average annual rate of TFP growth of 1.89% per year between 1920 and 1970. In 1970 to 2014, by contrast, the growth rate was only 0.64% per year, just a third the pace of 1920 to 70. This chapter argues that the 1920 to 70 upsurge in TFP growth reflected the importance of the great inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, IR number 2. Our interpretation is that the digital Third Industrial Revolution, IR number 3, though utterly changing the way Americans obtain information and communicate, did not extend across the full span of human life, as did IR number 2, with the epochal changes it created in the dimensions of food, clothing, housing, and its equipment, transportation, information, communication, entertainment, the curing of diseases and conquest of infant mortality, and the improvement of working conditions on the job and at home. The surge of TFP growth during 1920 to 70 culminated with 3 offshoots of IR number 2 that reached their current form 40 years or more ago, with only minor changes since: highway travel via the interstate highway system, jet commercial air travel, and ubiquitous air conditioning. The focal point of impact for IR number 3 came in the decade 1994 to 2004, when TFP grew at a rate of 1.03% per year, little better than half that of 1920 to 70, but substantially faster than the rates of 0.57% per year for 1970 to 1994 and 0.40 for 2004 to 14. In our interpretation, there was a one-time-only revolution in business practices that coincided with the marriage between personal computers and communication that occurred when Internet browsers were introduced in the mid-1990s. Offices made the transition from piles of paper and filing cabinets to flat screens and cloud storage. Paper library card catalogs and parts lists made their transition to searchable video screens. TFP growth responded, but when by 2004 the main elements of the web-enabled transition had taken place, the level of TFP had achieved a higher plateau, and the growth rate of TFP then slowed appreciably. No one can foresee the future, but we can ask whether the future is more likely to resemble the dot-com decade of 1994 to 2004, or the most recent decade, 2004 to 14. This chapter has assembled 2 types of evidence that the more rapid growth of TFP during 1994 to 2004 represented a temporary upsurge that is unlikely to be repeated. Descriptive assessments judge the pace of change in business practices, whether in the office, the retail store, or financial markets, to have slowed markedly after the rapid transition to modern methods achieved during the 1994 to 2004 decade. 6 types of objective measures all show a peak of activity during the late 1990s and a sharp slowdown, stasis, or even decline in the most recent decade. These include the number of daily transactions on the New York Stock Exchange, the rate of creation of new business firms, the growth of manufacturing capacity, the rate of net investment, the rate of improvement in the performance of computer equipment relative to its price, and the rate of improvement of the density of computer chips. The chapter calls attention to an apparent conflict between the excitement of techno-optimists regarding the newly enhanced capacity of artificial intelligence to mimic and surpass human activity versus the slow ongoing growth of TFP over the past decade. One resolution is that the replacement of human jobs by computers has been going on for more than 5 decades, and the replacement of human jobs by machines in general has been going on for more than 2 centuries. Occupations, such as financial advisors, credit analysts, insurance agents, and others, are in the process of being replaced. And these displaced workers follow in the footsteps of victims of the web who lost their jobs within the past 2 decades, including travel agents, encyclopedia salesmen, and employees of Borders and Blockbuster. Yet these previous job losses did not prevent the U.S. unemployment rate from declining to a rate near 5% in 2015, because new jobs were created to replace the jobs that were lost. Most of us in our daily life encounter many different types of employees, and we can play a game I call Find the Robot. Besides the ATM, the other robot I occasionally encounter is the automated e-kiosk check-in machine at airports. This innovation was rolled out between 2001 and 2005 and has thinned the ranks of airport ticket counter personnel. Just as earlier airline websites largely displaced travel agents and airline telephone agents, yet the rest of the employees needed to run an airline are still there, including skycaps, baggage handlers, flight attendants, pilots, air traffic controllers, and gate agents. Goods are still placed on supermarket shelves by store employees and by the drivers of delivery trucks for beer, bread, and soft drinks. Checkout lanes at retail markets are still manned by clerks rather than robots, and self-checkout lanes are few and far between. Haircuts, massages, and manicures are still exclusively the province of human workers, as are restaurants with their cooks and waitstaff. Hotels still have front desk personnel, and if they offer room service, it is delivered by humans rather than robots. Far from occurring overnight, the shift to robots and job-destroying artificial intelligence is occurring at glacial speed. Innovation alarmists write articles with titles such as How Robots and Algorithms Are Taking Over, and predict that output will increasingly be produced by robots and computer algorithms. Two visions compete in their forecasts for the next several decades. The techno-optimists predict much more rapid productivity growth as jobs are destroyed, and that the counterpart of exploding productivity growth is to be an age of persistent mass unemployment. The opposite vision extrapolates from the most recent decade and predicts more of the same, consisting of growth rather than shrinkage of employment, combined with the same historically low rate of growth of labor productivity observed during 2004 to 14. The symmetry of these opposing views belies the usefulness of the traditional adjectives optimistic and pessimistic. The techno-optimists focus on machines replacing humans, and are thus optimistic about future productivity growth, while pessimistically forecasting a future of job destruction and mass unemployment. The techno-pessimist view favored here recognizes the main dimensions of advance of robots and artificial intelligence, while stressing the slowness of their macroeconomic effects and the many sectors of the economy in which the interaction of workers and machines has changed slowly, if at all, in the past decade. Just as the techno-optimists are pessimistic about job growth, the techno-pessimists are optimistic that job growth will continue, and that new jobs will be created as rapidly as technology destroys old jobs. How can we choose between these sharply opposite visions? Numbers do not lie. Far from soaring toward the techno-optimists' vision of mass unemployment, the U.S. unemployment rate has declined rapidly, from 10.0 in October 2009 to 5.3%. in June 2015 and seems likely to decline below 5.0% by 2016. And far from exploding as people are replaced by machines and software, labor productivity has been in the doldrums, rising only 0.5% per year in the 5 years ending in the second quarter of 2015, in contrast to the 2.3% per year achieved in the dot-com era of 1994 to 2004. Now that the American economy has arrived back at a state of relatively full employment, it is hard to maintain the case that robots and artificial intelligence are creating a new class of the permanently unemployed. The problem created by the computer age is not mass unemployment, but the gradual disappearance of good, steady middle-class level jobs that have been lost not just to robots and algorithms, but to globalization and outsourcing to other countries, together with the concentration of job growth in routine manual jobs that offer relatively low wages. The gradual slowing of economic growth examined in this book combines disappointing productivity growth over the past decade with a steady rise of inequality over the past 3 decades. In the next chapter, we turn from the technological origins of the rise and fall of productivity growth to the headwinds that have intervened to prevent most Americans from enjoying real income gains equal to the growth of economy-wide output per hour. These headwinds constitute barriers to the equal distribution of productivity gains, including the effects of rising inequality, educational stagnation, declining labor force participation, and the fiscal demands of an aging population.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.